Hi everyone, I'm Maddie. Thank you so much for spending time watching this lecture. I hope that you have had a great day of GDS or are about to start a great day of GDS. Um, and I am so excited to continue working with you all. So today we're going to talk about human rights and sovereignty debates. I know that there are other lectures happening at GDS on rights in general. So we're going to focus on human rights. I think that that's something that's often talked about and invoked in arguments in principled arguments especially, is the human right to X and how that relates to this motion. Um, and then we're also going to kind of look at this in a more nuanced way by talking also about a critique of human rights that's often talked about within the international relations field and within the field of human rights as well. And that's the sovereignty critique, kind of talking about the extent to which countries are allowed to impede upon another country's sovereignty to hold them accountable for protecting the human rights of their people. So that's something that we're going to talk about. And as let's see, a quick outline for today. We're going to start with an introduction to human rights, to like the theory and field of human rights. Then we're going to talk about how to implement everything we've learned into writing principled arguments. And then we're going to look at this anti-imperial critique of human rights, anti-imperial in the sense that imperialism implies impeding on another country's sovereignty and ability to control its own government and its own governance of its people. And so that like the sovereignty, anti-imperial critique of human rights, how to implement these critiques in debate and recognize this human rights sovereignty clash in a debate, how to respond to that. And then we'll do a drill that implements that and we'll do some reflection. And I have some ideas for further reading for you all as well, if you're interested in this. So our goal today is to prompt a nuanced reflection on the concept of human rights. You are not going to leave this thinking human rights as a field is good or bad. You can, but the goal is more that we consider the necessity of human rights, the reason that they exist, the really positive framework that they provide for debate, and then also question this judgment. I think this is something that a lot of us came in with, but question and kind of problematize the idea of human rights and how they can also act as a justification for imperialism. So first, to start by defining human rights, we're going to spend quite a bit of time here doing this. So a simpler definition of human rights, just to give you an idea of what we're talking about, to differentiate this from other conceptions of rights. Human rights are fundamental rights to which all humans are entitled simply by being human. That means what it says. If you exist, you have human rights. They're fundamental. They can't be compromised with any justification. They also can't be created or violated by a government or political authority, and that's important, and we'll get into that later. But the government does not give you rights. The government also is not entitled to take those rights away. And they're designed to uphold inherent human dignity. So human rights are based on the premise that all people have this concept of dignity that they are entitled to, and they're also entitled to the rights necessary to protect that dignity. This dignity recognizes the inherent moral worth of people and of an individual person. So that's a bit abstract, but that's the general premise of human rights. Now we're also going to talk to get a bit more nuanced in this definition about the framework of human rights, which is something that, or a framework of human rights, which is something that was developed by Michael Goodhart. He's a professor and the director of the Global Studies Center at the University of Pittsburgh, and he wrote Human Rights, Politics, and Practice, which is a textbook that I would recommend if you're interested in looking a bit more into this. But he developed three different prongs of a framework of human rights, three different observations about what human rights are and what makes them different from other rights. First is that human rights are distinctively modern. The second being that human rights are a political invention, and the third that human rights are inherently revolutionary. Human rights meaning the framework, the concept of human rights. So first, to talk about the modernity, I think this is the most interesting aspect of this framework. So human rights are distinctively modern. This doesn't necessarily mean that there's nothing that's ever existed that human rights are descended from or were developed from. I think that would be kind of problematic to assume. There's a long history of values of rights as talked about in religion. Um, and from other sources, there was definitely a recognition of the fact that people have rights before this 1940s concept of human rights arose, which we'll talk about that 1940 date a bit more. But that really was when the invention of the concept of human rights and codification of the concept of human rights occurred. So it's distinctively modern. Um, and the reason for that, a few things. So the concept of human rights diverges from previous concepts of rights, one being natural rights, and then one being a positivist conception of rights. And we'll talk about what each of those mean. So first, human rights recognizes that rights should belong to everyone. They're fundamental. They're not status-based. They don't correlate to your status in society. All people have an equal level of access to these rights. And they're not derived from a ruler or from God, which is what natural rights are considered to be. Natural rights are considered to be bestowed upon you by a creator, um, and can also be considered to be status based. You can have more or less rights than the person next to you, and so human rights exist simply by the sake of being human. Um, and there's really not a lot of conversation in the human rights field about where rights come from. They just are. And that's something that's distinctively modern about human rights. Um, the human rights are also different from a conception of rights known as positivist. And positivist conceptions of rights says that rights are created by people, and sorry, that laws are created by people. And so laws and the rights that those laws protect are created by people, are created by governments. Without laws that create rights, without people that make up governments that create rights, rights do not exist. So the natural rights conception, rights bestowed by God; the positivist conception, rights bestowed by laws made by people in governments. Um, Human rights diverges from both of these and essentially just says we're not going to answer the question of who gives you rights, but we know that you have them, is what the human rights field says. Um, so the focus of human rights is not what is natural, is not what is legal, but what is moral. Human rights are based on, this is very abstract, obviously, since morality is a really subjective concept. But the field of human rights focuses on the inherent moral worth and human dignity of each person and says that each person is entitled to these human rights simply by the sake of existing. And something that really explains this is that the concept of human rights arose and was codified in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights post World War II. So this new conception of rights arose post World War II because there was a moral shock that arose out of World War II as the Holocaust was committed, as genocide was committed, where people were questioning previous conceptions of rights. Um, and questioning this positivist framework, especially of if rights are created by people and created by governments, and then governments violate these rights, to what extent do the rights still exist? Like, isn't that a circular argument? Isn't that hypocritical of us to say that governments are allowed to create rights and then you have them, but governments can also take them away, and who's holding them accountable? And so there was a moral shock that happened out of World War II, where this essentially spurred a new conception of rights as just existing, not being created by the government, but also as being based on a conception of morality. So rights are no longer subjected or rights are no longer subjectively created by a government's conception of what is legal. And rights aren't derived from laws, but something you can have a right that is in conflict with a law that exists that's created by your government, and your right, your human right, supersedes that law. Um, so there's a bit of a social contract idea here as well, if that's something that makes sense to you. The next two are a bit simpler. First, human rights are a political invention. They weren't an evolution. It wasn't an evolutionary process in the sense that we switched fairly dramatically from this pre-World War II to post-World War II conception of rights. So there was a political invention that occurred. There certainly is an evolutionary aspect to it. Other conceptions of rights contributed to the human rights field. But really, this was an invention because it occurred so suddenly based on the World War II atrocities. Um, and then human rights are also inherently revolutionary because by invoking human rights, you're asking for change. If you state this is a human right that I'm not receiving, that's a revolutionary act because you're asking a government to respect that right, or you're overthrowing a government on the basis that they're not respecting that right. Okay, so that's fairly abstract. If you're in a debate round, you're thinking, what human rights apply here? What human rights can I invoke? You can look to the codification of human rights that currently exists. Codification meaning simply where it's all written down, made plain and simple, and where it's written into existing law and documents. So the best place to look for that is going to be the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I pasted here, and it states all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. So you can see here kind of what I was talking about before, that there's no preamble that discusses where these rights come from. People are simply endowed them. People are not endowed them, people are simply born. Um, and endowed them by birth, by existing. They're not endowed them by a god or by a government. And you can see as you go through this, I would definitely recommend pausing here and taking just 2 minutes to scroll through this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I think it's really interesting because you can make an argument certainly that something is a human right without it being listed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but this is certainly the foundational document, so it's a lot harder to make those arguments if the rights aren't in here. Um, and I think that there are a lot of things that I assume would be a human right that aren't recognized as such in the UDHR. So definitely take some time to look through it. I would classify these rights into civil, political, social, economic, cultural, group, and collective rights. And I think that it's interesting to think about what are called these fourth wave human rights of the group and collective rights, because that's an even newer concept. And so civil, political, social, economic are fairly straightforward. And then cultural a little bit, and definitely group and collective rights are fairly distinct from that because they recognize that not only do individuals have rights, but people also have rights that have to be respected. So that's especially useful for discussions of social movements. For example, if you're discussing um, the greater severity of infringing upon an indigenous population's rights compared to if that was just any individual whose land rights were being infringed upon. If you're going to address the historical significance and the cultural significance of infringing upon the land rights of an entire group, of a collective, of an indigenous population in the United States, for example, then it's helpful to look at the collective rights and look at the rights in the UDHR through a collective lens. Then we can just take a minute and scroll through. Here you'll see the preamble, and then you'll see all of the articles of rights. And it's a fairly quick read. I would recommend just taking some time to scroll through these 30 articles. Awesome. So then I think the next question that makes sense to have is, to what extent are human rights binding? To what extent are governments bound to respect them? I'm not sure if you, at this point, you would have already seen the last lecture I recorded about international law and institutions. But as a recap, as new information, if you haven't seen it yet, the UDHR was not passed by the UN Security Council. It was passed within the UN, but not within the Security Council. And resolutions are only considered technically to be legally binding if they're passed through the Security Council. So the UDHR isn't technically legally binding, but that really doesn't mean a lot because states can still choose to retaliate against one another when they're not enforcing it. Or when they're not recognizing certain human rights, when they're not protecting certain human rights, because it is generally recognized by most states. The degree to which this is recognized depends on the right, but it's ingrained within customary law that a lot of these human rights are widely respected amongst countries. And so an act of a government to infringe upon certain rights would be seen as an act that warrants some sort of interference by another government, which is that sovereignty concept that we'll get into later. So these rights are really outlined in hopes that they become norms and that governments begin to see them as norms. human rights are binding to the extent that they're held accountable by other states, but also by other civil organizations, NGOs, civil society actors, Amnesty International, for example, um, organizations that monitor the adherence of states to protecting human rights treaties, to the UDHR, and the extent to which they're protecting human rights of their people and of their population. And one tactic that is often used and talked about within human rights is the tactic of naming and shaming. So an organization, a state will point out a human rights abuse or atrocity that's occurring within another state. And by naming it, the international community will gather around that and essentially bring this discussion, this shame to the government that's perpetrating that abuse in hopes that that creates a wide enough movement and a wide enough repercussions within the movement that the shame will stop. Um, that the act will stop. Three mechanisms or three examples of a mechanism that's often used within that are human rights reports. Human rights reports can be conducted by governments, can be conducted by these civil society actors. There's an Amnesty International one here. Human Rights Watch is another popular organization that conducts human rights reports. And so here's a Human Rights Watch report. And so you'll see it laid out here. This one is a threshold crossed Israeli authorities and the crimes of apartheid and persecution. So the Human Rights Watch is conducting a human rights report, essentially documenting. These are normally investigative reports in which the organization will be in the area interviewing people about their experiences and documenting every abuse that they find. Normally, these are based on the framework of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the human rights that are listed within that. And so they'll document these abuses of fundamental rights and such as land rights. And you'll see these reports go through each relevant right and how that right is being abused, the methodology, the background are normally in here, and then a catalog of all rights that are being violated by the government. And then you'll see recommendations for the government and for other states and other civil society actors to end that abuse at the end of the report as well. So something interesting is you'll see one from the Human Rights Watch, from Amnesty International, those civil society actors. The United States Department of State also conducts human rights reports annually on every country in the world. So the US likes to have these human rights reports where they're cataloging every abuse committed by every government. And we'll talk a little bit later about why that could be viewed as the United States doing a civic duty to protect human rights, and why it could also be viewed as the United States wanting to have pretext for intervention into other countries. Okay, so what does all of this mean for debate? The conversation about the extent to which human rights are binding. I think that the most essential thing that it means is that it's not enough to say that there is a human right to access to water, therefore we win. Therefore, states are legally bound legally obligated to respect this right. Why are we even having this conversation? Obviously, international law says. Really, you need to justify the right, why it's a human right, and so go through that definition of human rights that we talked about, why this right is so fundamental to an individual's human dignity, that if we're not fulfilling this right, if we're not recognizing it, then that is going against a recognition of an individual's inherent moral worth, and the fact that they're fundamentally, by the sake of existing, for the sake of being human, have to be entitled to this right. Humanity just loses so much of its meaning without them having access to this right. So we'll look at an example here that was used in a case that one of my teams constructed. So this case, this debate is about the right to be forgotten. So the right to be forgotten, just as context, meaning the right of an individual to request that an organization, their government, likely removes any record of them from the internet. For example, I'm in 5th grade. There's a video of me like falling off a swing set and doing something dumb. I'm about to go on a first date. I really don't want that to be the first thing that pops up when they search my name. I ask the government to take it down, right? That's like not the gravity of why we're having this conversation, but just to illustrate definitionally what the right to be forgotten is. Um, so our first argument here is that the right to be forgotten respects an individual's right to autonomy. So we say that autonomy is a basic, fundamental human right. Pretty big claim there, right? All individuals are entitled to autonomy by being human, but it's also fairly easy to justify. So the way that we do that is first name the human right. This should be more specific than what is already named in the motion. For example, if the motion is this house believes that blah, 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 education. You should not say all individuals have a human right to education, right? You should do something that is related to what's already mentioned in the motion by going a bit deeper, right? So if you're talking about um, an individual's right to have land and or a group's right to have land in this specific area, it's likely not going to be super beneficial to talk about land rights. You're going to want to break that down a bit more. People have the right to economic security. People have the right to safety of their person, to autonomy. All of those things are violated when people don't have land. So you don't want to just take what's in the motion, call it a right, and call it a day. Um, Next, you're going to justify the right as being a human right. So what we talked about, go back to that definition, why all reasonable people should agree that this is a human right. Maybe how we already recognize this right. That's something that we do here, that governments are based on the idea of the consent of the people. This presumes the validity of the human right to autonomy. So like most governments recognize rights that are already extensions of the right to autonomy, such as free speech, free press. In doing so, they're inherently recognizing and agreeing with us about the importance of this right to autonomy, right? So justify the right as being a human right. Don't just say that it is, say why it's so fundamental that it's classified as a human right. Then you want to explicitly connect the right to the motion. So an out here for the other team is say, yeah, we agree that autonomy is a basic human right. We don't think that that's related significantly to the right to be forgotten. We think that maybe um, we think that actually autonomy lands with our side because if an individual is going on a first date with me, they have a right to know before they go on that date that I fell off a swing set in fifth grade, right? And you can obviously think of some more severe examples of that when it could potentially strip an individual of their autonomy to vote, not to have this information about an elected official that the elected official or candidate requested be taken offline, right? So you want to say why your side is the side that fulfills that right so that the other side cannot co-opt it. And then last, you're going to anticipate and weigh against other potential rights. So likely, even though you kind of got ahead of the curve here and connected the human right to your side of the motion, the other side is probably going to want to debate you on that. And so you'll anticipate why this doesn't fall on their side, as they may say, or weigh it against another right, such as if the other side claims that there is a human right to knowledge, why you think that your right is more important, and implement some weighing techniques there. Okay, so next let's talk a bit briefly about a critique of human rights, which is a fairly substantial critique, which is kind of this neo-colonial, neo-imperialist critique. So there are quotes here that illustrate two sides of this debate. First, self-determination may serve to bar more tightly the sovereign gates which exclude intervention of any kind, including intervention aimed at the protection and promotion of rights of individuals. And this is from a political scientist by the name of Rupert Emerson in 1975. Essentially, what he's saying here is that this concept of self-determination, that people are entitled to self-determination, to sovereignty, to act according to the will of their own government, not to be influenced by the wills of other governments or of other people. This concept can be harmful because it prevents states from acting when there are human rights abuses occurring within those states. If states have complete self-determination, they have the right to do anything in their governance of their people, including violating their human rights. So this is saying that human rights are a necessary tool, even when compromising self-determination or sovereignty, because the human rights and fulfillment of human rights of people within that government being violated are the most pressing concern. On the other side of this, we have a quote from an author, Adam Getachew, in 2019 in a recent book she published called World Making After Empire, which I would definitely recommend as further reading for either side of this. It's really, really helpful context. And she says, privileging and prioritization of the moral worth of individuals coincides with the diminution of collective claims to sovereignty and self-determination, which have historically served to restrain imperialism. So she's saying that this invention of the field and theory of human rights um, can actually be really harmful um, to to our attempts to move past imperialism and to value sovereignty and self-determination of states, because states can wield the justification, and in some cases it's genuine, in some cases it's pretext for gaining other benefits by intervening into an area, by saying this intervention is in the name of human rights. That's why we're justified in violating the sovereignty of this state in which we're intervening. So in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which we talked about before, Article 1 actually recognizes the right to self-determination as a human right. So it says, furthermore, no distinction shall be made on the basis of the political, jurisdictional, or international status of the country or territory to which a person belongs, whether it be independent, trust, non-self-governing, or under any other limitation of sovereignty. So it recognizes, this section recognizes that any government and people living within any government are entitled to all of the rest of the human rights listed in the Charter, and entitled to the protection of those and seeking recourse through resources provided by the United Nations and through mechanisms of the United Nations, like the ICC, for example, the International Criminal Court, which we talk about in our other lecture. Even if you live in a territory that has limited sovereignty, you're still entitled to all of these other rights. So this frames imperialism itself as a violation of human rights, because it means that if another government is imposing itself on your state or on your region, your government, and it's violating your representation in government, it's violating your freedom of movement, any rights that are violated by the process of imperialism, people living in the peripheries of empires and the governed territories governed by other states and empires are also entitled to these rights. So in this case, imperialism itself is a violation of human rights. There's also UN Resolution 1514, which I think is really interesting and was really contentious to pass, that lists self-determination explicitly as a human right and says that not just states, not just all people within states that don't have self-determination are entitled to human rights, which is what Article 1 of the chart of the UDHR says, but UN Resolution 1514 actually says that all people individually are entitled to the right to self-determination. So that makes imperialism itself, in plain language, makes it a violation of human rights. Just some historical background on this that Getachew addresses in her book. The right to self-determination took a lot of debate to get there. There was a lot of debate to pass Resolution 1514 because several Western imperialist nations forming the United Nations, forming these founding documents, wanted to support the idea of human rights, the field of human rights, but didn't want that to extend to non-self-governing territories or to areas that were being governed within empires, to peripheries that were conquered within empires. And so there was a lot of work done here by the Black Pan-African movement of the 1940s to get this passed. And the Black Pan-African movement was a group of leaders within African states that were pursuing post-imperial national self-determination and pursuing independent statehood. And so there was a coordinated effort, and they were doing so with aspirations towards unity of African states and representation of African states. And so there was a lot of work done here by the Black Pan-African movement to pass this fundamental right to self-determination, largely because they anticipated the issue of human rights as a theory, as a concept being used as a justification for imposing a government upon another government said to be violating human rights. Um, the assumption being that even if that's true, the imposing government is also likely violating human rights. And so another state could just as easily justify that, use the justification of human rights to impede that state's sovereignty. It's really just an issue of power, which state is more powerful and has the power to impede another state's sovereignty in the name of or with the genuine motive of fulfilling human rights of the people living there. Um, so you see this clash here that there's a human right to self-determination, but also human rights, other human rights, other than the right to self-determination, only are really existing and enforceable to the extent that governments and hold one another accountable, and also that organizations hold governments accountable. And so you see how there's a clash here that is likely going to come up in a lot of debates. Um, Edward Said is another author who I would recommend reading about this clash, specifically his book, Culture and Imperialism. And he talks about this clash as well. An example that he uses is he says that the United States has intervened in the so-called, what he says is the third world every year since 1945 and 1967. And he says that each of these times there has been some sense of moral fervor and a sense of a mission in invading another country. And the widely distributed message is that this is being done in the name of human rights. And you can see that it's a repeated pattern, a repeated behavior used to justify intervention into another country. And it's up to your own research and your own interpretation and the side you get with an emotion. And your analysis of a specific situation in a specific country as to whether there's a justification for intervention based on the circumstances, or whether it's pretext and it's extending imperialism, and a country is simply saying that they're taking this action in the name of human rights. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and implement um, and use everything we've learned about human rights and about critiques of human rights. And so in this drill, you're going to write a principled argument. So principle, practical, I think by this point you've probably watched the lectures and we've talked a bit in lab about the difference between those. But this definitely lends itself to a principled argument. So you're going to look at these two motions and you're going to submit in the link provided here. There are different motions for red and blue, gold and silver. Honestly, I think they're about a similar level of difficulty. It's just to mix it up and so that you get exposed to a few motion ideas. So if you're in red and blue and you want to try the gold and silver motion later and just kind of think about it, get your thoughts going and vice versa, then you can do that as well. So in the gold silver example, the motion is this House would sentence celebrities to harsher sentences for criminal convictions. So you're going to develop a principled argument based on a human right. You can choose a side of the motion, whichever side you want. And you're going to write, for example, on proposition for the gold silver motion, you would say that this is necessary, or I think opposition is a bit easier, but on opposition for the gold silver motion, you could say that this violates some fundamental right by giving different sentences to different groups of people, and you would pick the right, and that would be your principle, is this violates the human right to so-and-so. There are a few different directions you could take on both of these with different rights. If you need inspiration, you can look at the UDHR. Don't forget when you're doing this, I would refer back to that slide where we talked about the justification of rights. Or I would refer back to that example where I walked through kind of those 4 steps and try to do that as you're writing this argument. Optional, a challenge if you'd like it, especially for red and blue labs, is to write an A2 response to the human rights-based argument that you wrote, invoking a critique of the human rights framework. So say, yeah, this is important, but you could make a sovereignty argument. Those are a bit challenging with these motions, or you can just think of how else you would respond. But have the sovereignty conversation in the back of your head and think if there's a way that you could employ that as well. And then go ahead and submit to that link when you're done. You can pause here, do the drill, and then come back for the final reflection. and just take about 5-10 minutes, time yourself so that you don't go too far over. When you're doing this, just outline what you don't have time to write, just use as much as you can, but whoever's reading it will definitely get the gist. This is more about your process of doing it. A final reflection, if you'd like to do it, just take like 2 minutes to do this, but you can review these two human rights reports that I've posted in the speaker's notes that I'll add into the slide so you can all access them. But there's one human rights here report here conducted by the United States, one conducted on the United States. And so you can see here um, how a nation can simultaneously document human rights abuses occurring within another state while committing the same or different human rights abuses within their own. And maybe just think about this. There's nothing to submit here, just something for you to think about. But I'll post those links by the time that this gets to you all. And so a final reflection, human rights are a modern conception of rights as egalitarian, fundamental, and universal. And you can look back on that framework we talked about for review if you'd like. Human rights are relevant in debate, but only if you explain why. It's not enough to call something a human right and call it a day and say that you won and go home. That would be too simple. And human rights can be invoked to overcome imperial forces, but they can also be weaponized as a justification for impeding upon sovereignty and for carrying out imperialism by states. So it's important to think about that just in general when you're reflecting on certain issues, but also within round. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching this lecture, for spending this time with me. And here's some further reading if you're interested, just a few different works, some just explaining more about human rights as a field, and then some explaining about critiques. And there's my email. Please feel free to email with questions. I will be checking it. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day. See you all soon.